Okay, so I want to talk about a few things in this video, and I got to get to some really serious stuff near the end or near the middle or wherever it may fall. But I assure you there's going to be some thought-provoking information in this video. If you stick with me, play it in the background, whatever you have to do. I've consistently held the position throughout the progression of this coronavirus situation that I don't think it's going to turn into a Mad Max, grid down, civilization-ending event. I think it's ultimately going to be resolved at some point. That said, there are still several things which are concerning to me, so let's dive into that. What I'm going to do in this video is draw parallels between the 1918 Spanish flu and what's currently going on right now, to see if we can get a read on where this is going. So here's the problem with the Spanish flu death estimates. The biggest problem with that is that there was never any test kits at the time, okay? People were dropping like flies, and it was thought that most people were dying of related complications and not of the flu itself. So it really was impossible for them to ever get a read on how many people had actually passed away. That's more of a recent thing, that we have the technology to do that, but there are still limitations to the technology. There was a shortage of testing kits for the longest time, and of course, there has been very little conversation about the validity of the numbers coming out of China. The international community is seemingly taking them on their word. I guess that's the best approach we can take at this point, but we have to consider the logistics of how many people is it physically possible to test a day. The last information I heard had indicated that some of these tests are quote-unquote rapid, but they still take between a half an hour to 2 hours to complete. So a half an hour to 2 hour tests, if you're running 3,000 people a day, that's a lot of time and energy and organization to coordinate all of that activity. Now, I'm sure they have an efficient system, or at least one which is maturing, in order to process all of that information, but now they're saying that the confirmed cases have plateaued. But what does that really mean? Do they have enough test kits to test more than 3,000 people a day? Do they have enough manpower to do that every day? These are the questions I think that need to be answered, and they're harder questions that China needs to be pressed on so we can actually get a good read of what is really going on. Now, you could argue that the strategy might be, well, we don't want to alienate China, so we don't want to come down on them too hard and condemn them, because then they're probably not going to want to share any information with us at all. So if that's the strategy they're taking, I don't think it's the best one to take necessarily, but I can understand where they're coming from. But there appears to be, at least from the media sources that I've seen, and there's always new information coming out every hour, so, this could all change by the time this video is released, but it seems as though the international community is not too concerned with a lot of that nuance, and they're just taking China on its word. Even if this came to the United States or Canada, we would only be able to test so many people, meaning that you could only effectively tally the total infected for so long before your capacity to do so just failed to keep pace with all the new infections. Unless you had like an instantaneous rapid test where you could poke everyone with a needle and it instantly gave you the results, it would be very hard to organize all that information into a central hub. I mean, you'd have to write some new program to keep track of all of that information. I'm not saying it can't be done, but just thinking about the speed at which something like this might progress, I don't think that they're able to take an accurate census of this. And I seldom see the limitations of testing discussed. Even if you had an abundance of test kits, you need the manpower and the time to run all those tests. It's just presumed that there's this many cases a day because there's that many being confirmed. But that is in no way, shape, or form necessarily a reflection of what's out there. But what really strikes me about the erroneous nature of these numbers that are being reported is that you would think in the least they would be saying greater than. You think that they would at least put that qualifier in there, that there's greater than 40,000 cases. Because if you have that many cases confirmed, that means that there's a lot more than that out there. Now again, this doesn't mean it's the end of the world, it just means that maybe there should be more emphasis on that point. So I've been really trying to not rock the boat on this one, and for the sake of minimizing panic and, not wanting to be deplatformed also, that's another concern that we have to worry about as YouTubers, because apparently now thinking divergently is becoming illegal. You can't even present a non-provocative, thoughtful monologue on something without it being taken as misinformation or disinformation, even though you're just trying to figure out what's actually going on. Because the numbers that the WHO is relying on are obviously scientifically incomplete. Now, of course, They word it on the website in such a way that it's likely that these numbers exceed, but there should be more emphasis on that point, because that could have profound implications. If these numbers are not actually representative of what is going on right now, that could have massive implications, which could see this becoming as pervasive as the flu. And if you have something that's as pervasive as the flu, with 25 times the fatality rate, you may as well start recruiting tens of thousands of nurses now while you still have time, because it's going to get ugly. Now, am I saying that they should be all hyperbolic and sound the alarm and get everybody into a panic frenzy? Obviously not. Obviously, part of their job is to keep people calm, because that is one of the ways, which I've talked about in many videos before, that sometimes if you trigger a panic, it's just going to make the virus spread faster, because you're going to lose control of society. The social order is going to start to disintegrate, and you don't want to do that either. So I understand where they're coming from, but it just seems that their projections need to be a bit more practical and realistic, because right now it doesn't appear that they're doing that. Now look, obviously the WHO is staffed with very intelligent people, but they also have public relations obligations which may get in the way of delivering the entire story to the public, because maybe it's deemed to be for the greater good, or who knows what the possible motivations might be. I'm not saying that they are not a credible source of information at all, and there probably are reasons why they're so elementary in their explanations of these things, just so that it's palatable for the masses. It just doesn't appear that their projections of what's going to happen is aligned with reality. Now, I could be wrong about that, but that's my intuition about all this. I mean, when you have the one doctor here on YouTube, John Campbell, who appears to be going into 10 times the amount of depth that you're going to find on the World Health Organization's website, then I think something is wrong with blindly following them into battle without question. Even though they might be providing the best, most easy to digest summary of what's going on, if you have a guy like Dr. John Campbell who's becoming ever more convinced on a day-to-day basis that this is going to become a pandemic, then I think that that's a perspective that we should heed. So I've listened to this audiobook twice through now, and it's called Very, Very, Very Dreadful, the 1918 Pandemic, and it talks all about the so-called Spanish flu, which we now know is actually H1N1, which originated in a US military base, and which spread around the world and totally ravaged the world, unlike anything that ever came before it. It's a very good, engaging book. The narration is excellent. The author provides a very riveting and raw perspective on the gruesomeness of that time. So I'd strongly recommend it. I'm going to put a link in the description to that audiobook if you're interested. You got to hook up an Audible account, obviously, or you could just get the book. I would strongly recommend it so you can also see the progression of how many countries didn't want to report it as being a problem, of course, until it was one that they couldn't deny was a problem. Now, listening to this got me thinking about how likely is it that a global pandemic of the same scope and magnitude, relatively speaking, of course, because our population is now 4 times as much, what is the probability of that happening today? Because we're always hearing that this is inevitable, that it's bound to happen, but what is the actual probability? Well, in 1918 to 1919, that was the closest that human beings have come to a full-blown SHTF situation ever in history, or 5 to 10 years, give or take, on the other side of World War II. Those were hard times for the world. It was introduced into Europe and it was spread throughout the world when the US military entered World War I. Now, the Spanish flu decimated the world's population. It killed more people than all of the plagues in all of human history combined up until that point, and we've yet to see something on that scale since. It's thought that nearly 50 to 100 million people died, and up to 500 million people, or 1/3 of the world's population, was infected. Now, the book does an excellent historical analysis, and it goes all the way back in time when human beings were nomadic. And the idea was that nomadic people didn't really contract these viruses. They lived longer, they were stronger, they were taller than their agriculture or horticultural counterparts, because they were constantly on the move. It was the sedentary conditions brought by a premature civilization, if you will, that created the breeding ground for pests and diseases. You suddenly had all these people who were living these agrarian lifestyles where they were sedentary, they were living in close proximity to each other, and of course animal husbandry became a primary source of food. So people for the first time ever were living in close quarters with all of these different types of animals. The ones that we most commonly eat are the ones where a lot of these infections come from, that is birds and pigs. So it was the prematurity of industrialization in that the original cities were hellholes. There are few sanitary regulations, people just pooped wherever they wanted, and thus you had the bubonic plague. Now when the Spanish flu came around, during World War I, the conditions were horrendous. You had so many people who were malnourished, who were stressed out, who were on the front lines. Resources were stretched thin for every country around the world. It was the imperialist era where a lot of countries that had just been colonized were in political disarray, and they were trying to shift away from pastoral or horticultural into an industrial way of life. But because of the destitute living conditions of trench warfare, and because you also had the dawn of global transportation, and you also had a very limited understanding of viral diseases within the medical community, you had a limited understanding of vaccines, and you had a limited understanding of personal hygiene and how it related to health. And of course, there was little to no treatment for any of this stuff. So you really had the perfect storm of conditions that led to the Spanish flu. You had this mixing of troops coming from all over the world, mixing in these trenches which were teeming with rats and pests and lice, where you had malnourished men who were on the brink of psychological insanity. Needless to say, it was an incredibly fertile ground for one of these superbugs to take root, and that it did. Now, the flu wasn't what took a lot of these people out, but it was what weakened them to the point where a bacterial infection might take them out. If the person was malnourished or vitamin deficient or had some sort of comorbidity, like most people did at the time, where life expectancy was a lot lower than it was today, people were going to be dropping like flies, and that they did. Now, if we fast forward today and we're trying to make estimations on the basis of that major pandemic, of how likely something like that is to happen today, because we're always being told by epidemiologists and virologists that it's only a matter of when, not if, something like this is going to happen. Is that actually true, is the question. Well, let's look at some of the variables at play here. What are the vulnerabilities of the current system? Well, the biggest vulnerability of the current system is the speed of global transport. A virus could potentially be spread around the world in a matter of hours. In 1918, it would take weeks, if not months, for something like that to take root. That is vulnerability number one. Vulnerability number two is that we live in more densely populated communities than we ever have before. During 1918, the overwhelming majority of the planet lived in rural environments, and the population was only 20% of what it is today. And that's probably the only reason why it only infected 1/3 of the human population and not the entire population, because you had those bigger buffers between the urban and the rural communities. The more people a virus has to burn itself through, the greater the chance for mutations. Most of those mutations might be innocuous, but some could be very bad. We now have dozens of cities that have populations that rivaled the countries of old. These two factors alone are probably the biggest threats. Now, thirdly, we also eat more meat than we ever have before. This means that we're producing more food, which means more potential for humans to come into contact with animals. However, the process has become a lot more regulated since then, where people are not living amongst animals in the cities, at least in the most developed countries. A lot of that process is now segregated from human beings, and you only see the meat when it gets to the grocery store. But fourthly, there's the factor of invasive species and pushing animals out of their natural habitats to industrialize. The more we turn up soil and prod at nature with our machines, the more potential for us to open a can of worms that we can't put back. It can be likened to the idea of looking at ice core samples and reawakening ancient viruses which maybe have been lying dormant in the ice for thousands, if not millions of years. If we were to potentially do that, if the permafrost were to melt, one of these viruses could be potentially unleashed. And that's not science fiction, that's a proven fact. The more we push nature to the fringes, the greater the likelihood that we are going to come into contact with viruses. Now, those are our vulnerabilities, and I'm sure there are a lot more that I didn't touch on. Now let's take a look at our strengths. We have far better detection systems than we did before. We have far better medicine than we have before. We know a lot more. The majority of people nowadays are not malnourished and stressed out and resource and vitamin depleted like they were during the time of World War I, where everything was stretched thin. Remember, that was a perfect storm, which would be very hard to replicate for today. Sure, we have the population density and the hypertransport. We don't have the collective compromised immunity for something like that to happen again. So the theory I would align myself with is the one that says, look, if something were to happen that suddenly compromised the standard of living of the majority of people on the planet, like a major economic collapse, a global conflict, an EMP from the sun, if there are ongoing crop failures and worldwide austerity, those are the conditions which we would really have to start to worry about one of these large-scale sweeping pandemics passing through. And of course, the virus would have to be a novel one, a new one for which we had no herd immunity. That's not to say that a virus cannot take root in the current conditions, because again, something can spread very fast. Now, if we just look at all these variables, then we can infer what would have to be the case for a superbug to overtake the planet, one with a high lethality. While it would have to have an extended incubation period, it would have to be transmissible during that incubation period. It would have to be mutatable, so there could be many waves of the disease. It would have to have the ability to be airborne. And I'm not talking about droplets, I'm talking about aerosolized airborne, which would lend itself to a very high R0 value in which one person could potentially infect many, many more. And it would have to have a low enough mortality rate that it could still be infectious and have a high R0 value. Now, I know what most of you who are informed are thinking. You're thinking that sounds a lot like the coronavirus. And based on the most up-to-date information, if we take what the Chinese government is saying as fact, then that may well be the case. Right now, we're not seeing a lot of fatalities outside of China because those systems aren't overwhelmed yet. Dr. John Campbell, who publishes videos on this daily, and seems to be the only person who is really investigating every minutia of this matter, doesn't think that the ethnicity of people is having a factor in terms of the mortality rate or how bad it affects somebody. And he is thinking that this is going to become a panic. Now, we've seen what can happen on the cruise ships, in which this spreads like wildfire. We've seen how inept some countries are in terms of doing their testing. So one can only imagine that they've reached their ability to count cases every day, and that this is probably a lot more widespread than they're indicating. Now, we cannot prove that, and I don't think it's good to just run by that and die on that hill, so to speak. Probably not the best metaphor to use, but it certainly does signal that this may be something that is with us from here on in. Now, of course, summer is coming, and even though we don't know a whole lot about this particular virus, I guess the conventional science dictates that most viruses don't like warm weather. So hopefully we start to see a slowdown come springtime, but that's yet to be known yet because, once again, this is a novel virus. A virus today, to accomplish what the Spanish flu accomplished, proportionally speaking, would have to be very intelligent. And by intelligent, I just mean very dynamic in the aforementioned ways that I talked about. So there is a possibility of it happening, but what this current outbreak has demonstrated is that the hyper-regulation of our modern urbanized world has had a positive corralling effect. Even though it's gotten very out of hand in China, we can see that it hasn't really taken root in other countries yet, although, by the time I'm done this video, it may well have, because in Singapore and many other Asian countries, it does appear that it is starting to cluster a bit. And of course, if that happens, it's going to be very hard for other countries to segregate themselves. You're just going to have so much segregation that it's ultimately going to lead to an economic recession. Right now it's not, but if it takes root in these other countries like it has in China, that means more closed borders, that means increased isolationism, a reduction in global trade, and ultimately economic downturn. But the system's resilience right now is very surprising. Now, this may not hold true 1 month from now, and we'll realize that we're still not as smart as Mother Nature as this thing becomes more and more pervasive. That's a possibility, okay? But I'm trying to be optimistic here because I can be optimistic because I'm already prepared. I'm already prepared for the worst, so why not consider some of the more positive outcomes? In my video about the great pandemic and how to prepare for it, I talk about these things called fomites, which entered pop culture vernacular after the movie Contagion in the year 2014. And a fomite is basically an inanimate object, or an animate one, that a virus is transferred from. It's basically like a vector, not necessarily a vector, but it's a way that a virus can be transmitted from one person to another, be it on an inanimate surface, a railing, a button on an ATM machine. But because we are living in a society now which is more germ conscious, people are washing their hands more, there's hand sanitizer everywhere you go, there's a general sterility now that comes with living in an urbanized world, which is also affecting modern men, I should say, which is why fertility rates are so low. But that in itself is a protective factor against this. So I would say that the only thing preventing something like this from going wild right now is the fact that the economy, generally speaking, the global economy that is doing as well as it is, and the standard of living keeps going up. If there was a downturn in the standard of living and people had to start to incorporate more of those agrarian methods into their lives again, where you had many people living in densely populated regions, breeding chickens, or doing the wet market thing like they've done in China for many years. If there is a technological regression, then definitely we could potentially see a viral outbreak of a magnitude which was equivalent to the Spanish flu. Now that said, human beings, as we evolve, so are viruses also evolving. And the influenza is excellent for that. That's why you need to get a different flu shot every year, because it's constantly mutating and changing. In the same way that pigeons and squirrels and rats have made their own ecosystems built around our cities, in the same way nature is doing the same thing with viruses. The viruses are evolving alongside us because they have no other choice. We are their host. This novel virus that we're faced with right now has that potential. The main thing that's preventing this from going crazy right now is cleanliness. There is a reason why 18 million people died in India from the Spanish flu. It was the country most ravaged by the Spanish flu. 6.1% of their population perished. The total number of their population was over 300 million people, and 18 million perished as a result of the Spanish flu. It is the abject, impoverished, destitute living conditions which viruses like these thrive on, mutate in, and are able to strengthen themselves to the point where they spread to other parts of the planet. The book, very dreadful, is one I would strongly recommend, because the way the conditions, especially in the trench hospitals on the front lines, where the majority of people between the years 1918 and 1919 were admitted for flu-like complications, not for being casualties of the conflict itself. The author and the narrator are able to communicate this in vividly gruesome detail and tell a story that needs to be told and needs to be more common knowledge. I wouldn't be surprised if they made a movie about it after this coronavirus, now that everybody has taken an interest in this sort of thing, or at least will have no choice but to take an interest. Hollywood is definitely going to capitalize on that after we bounce back from the possible recession that we're going to face after the smoke clears here. And I would strongly recommend it if you want to try to wrap your head around what a real SHTF situation would look like and was. Because it was at that time that after that second wave of the Spanish flu that many physicians even thought that this might be the end of civilization. You had the worst war in human history, and you had what appeared to be the worst outbreak in human history, all happening at once. People were dropping like flies everywhere. So it wasn't hard to believe that a lot of people thought that it literally was the end of civilization. Fortunately for our sake, it wasn't. So go and check out that book. I'm going to post a link in the description. There's an Audible version, which I highly recommend. And I'm going to conclude with this thought. As I often said before, I'm an agnostic, meaning I don't know what to believe. I don't know if there's a God or if there isn't a God, okay? But what I do know about Christian ideology, because I was raised in it, I was raised Roman Catholic, is that the four horsemen of the apocalypse all seem to come in succession. And this seems to be in line with what happened in WW1, is that you had conflict, you had pestilence, you had disease, and of course you had death. All of these SHTF events appear to coalesce at once. at whichever point in history you're in, because the likelihood of one happening increases if another happens. The more conflict there is, the greater the probability of a pandemic emerging, the greater the likelihood of economic instability, and thus the potential for regional, national, international conflict. This doesn't mean we have this beat and that it's never going to be a problem. It very well may become a problem. Because on the flip side, and this is the wild card that I didn't talk about, is that as much as we have better immunity now because people are eating better and we have better nutrition, we're also not playing in the dirt like we once did. We've become very soft and very weak in a lot of ways. There was a time when human beings could drink lake water. We can't do that anymore without getting sick. There was a time where we could eat raw meat and our bodies could process the parasites. We can't do that anymore. So long as technology holds strong, we're okay. But if there's a chink in the armor of our technological apparatus that shields civilization from the elements, you can bet that nature will find a way to exploit it. Not because it's evil, just because it's opportunistic. That's when we're going to be in trouble. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Thanks for watching. Check out that book. I'll leave a link below. Canadian Prepper out.